Hello, this is our third class. Today we're going to finish off looking at some things about the book of Judges, and then we're going to go on and start talking about the books of Samuel. So here I'm on the fourth page of notes about Judges, and then you will have also, by the time you look at this, the notes that are for both of the books of Samuel together. More about that in a second. Okay, so let's look just at the fourth page here. I want to say a few things about some of the things mentioned on this page, and then we can go on. I want to say again how useful I think that outline of the book of Judges that is on the second page is, that organizes the material into a sort of overall pattern and story, which otherwise is quite obscure in the book of Judges, being filled as it is with lots of good stories, but one story after another. The overall argument, I think, helps put things into perspective. And if you look here at the top of page 4, if we look in the first chapter beginning with verse 17, we can also see that the book itself is setting up an understanding of the situation in which these stories are played out, right? Judah went with Simeon, his brother, these, of course, being the tribes, right? The descendants of these people, not Judah and Simeon, two guys. They're long dead. Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction, harmed it, right? Destroyed everything. So the name of the city was called Hormah. That thing which has been harmed is what Hormah means. It's like Ai, which means ruins. Okay, so so it used to be Zephath, now it's Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Right? Very clearly saying that the children of Israel have some military successes. They do not clear the territory, and they do not clear the lowland, with the richer parts, right? So they occupied all of northwestern West Virginia, but they could not occupy any of Connecticut because the people there were able to resist them. In other words, they're pushed off in a poor corner. They're not where the rich people are, right? Because the rich people have chariots of iron. Right? So this is the beginning of the Iron Age now. Specialty uses for iron are beginning to develop. And of course, the chariots are not completely made of iron. They have iron fittings, in the same way that when we hear later about people with ivory, like in the book of Amos, when they have, ivory chairs and ivory beds, those cows of Bashan, right? That doesn't mean that they're made completely of ivory, ivory not being strong enough for that kind of thing. They're inlaid with ivory. Furniture of this description has been discovered archaeologically, so we know exactly what that kind of stuff looked like for them. Just so you know. But the poor people don't have iron. The rich people in the lowlands have iron. That's where Sisera gets his iron chariots. Okay. So that sets out quite clearly what's, the physical situation. Now, if you look at the very beginning of chapter 2, which is also still in the build up to the book, right? Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, which means weeping people. Plural weepers is what it means. It means weepers. And they sacrifice there to the Lord. So that sets, in the same way that the children of Israel in the hills, um, Canaanites in the lowlands is the practical situation. The theological situation here at the beginning of 2 is that the children of Israel have been disobedient, and because of that the Lord will not do for them what he said he would before, that he would do if they were obedient. And so they're going to have to live in a more difficult situation. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare for you. You will have practical difficulties, thorns in your sides, and theological religious difficulties, their gods shall be a snare to you. Okay? Which is, of course, what happens in the book of Judges. That's what the book of Judges is all about. So the book itself, I would say, supporting the stuff we saw on page 2 with the overarching picture suggestion of the book. I think there is good reason to think that the book of Judges itself sets up quite clearly both a practical struggle and a religious struggle that the children of Israel are going to undergo over and over and over again in the book of Judges. Continually, when they get a good judge, then he or she leads them to do the right thing. When they do the right thing, they get a good result. The land has rest, and then after a while of good result, they begin to fall away because they're fallen people, and that's the way the story goes. Okay. Just a few quick notes. Gideon, who is right in the middle of this book as the high point and beginning of the fall off, right? Gideon is also, you noticed, the only person who experiences a rebellion against him, his son Abimelech, right? One of the things to know about Abimelech, as I said last time, it's very interesting that, we hear about all these judges, and a lot of them have lots of sons and lots of daughters, and they ride on donkeys and all that kind of stuff. Abimelech is named, right? Partly, I think, because he is the leader of this rebellion that we're going to be told about, and partly, as I said last time, because his name is Abimelech, which means my father, Abi, is the king, Melech, right? If you are a father and you name your son Abimelech, you are saying more about yourself than you are about your son, right? And that is something which, among other things, is not true. There's real signs in the stories about Gideon that he's acting in a kingly manner inappropriately, not being the king, but there are good reasons to think that he really thinks he is the kind of the king or ought to be the king, and the smoking gun is naming his son Abimelech, which is why we're told that. So it's not at all surprising, and as a matter of fact, it's very significant that the man with the son, my father is the king, is the one who seems to be, like a rocket, seems to be about to escape the atmosphere and then plunges back down to a disastrous end, as a personal microcosm of what's going on in the book, right? Gideon's career sort of encapsulates the whole problem of Israel in the book of Judges. When he does the right thing, everything goes right, but the more he does the right thing and the more right it goes, the more he seems tempted to do the wrong thing, which is, if you have to do a one sentence, what's a one sentence outline of what goes on in Judges? That's probably it. When they do the things right, they get good results, and the better results they get, the more they're tempted to do things wrong. Okay. Let's see. Let me just quickly look at chapter 10 here, verses 6 through 8. We talked in the last time the difficulties. Well, the point that if you read carefully, it's clear that the book does not give us a reason to think that the judges we are shown are ruling all of Israel. They are ruling parts of Israel, part of the children of Israel. They tend to be tribally based, right? The tribe, Shaphat, has a shofet, a judge. And if we think of them as tribal chieftains, we do better than anything else. And remember that children of Israel is a collection of 12 tribes. It's not one tribe, right? Chapter 10, verses 6 through 8. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines. They forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines and into the hand of the Ammonites, and they crushed and oppressed the people of Israel that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the people of Israel who were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. So they are not, when the Lord hands them over into the hands of these people, he's not handing all of Israel over into the hands of these people. They're only oppressing the people on the far side of the Jordan, the eastern side of the Jordan River, right? So when we hear the land has rest, the judge arises, all this, there is the possibility that this is a partial thing going on. And there have been some very complicated attempts to make a timeline out of the whole book of Judges. I think we do not have enough information to do that, but of the scholars who were interested in this question, I do not know of anyone who thinks that that the book leads us to think that the judges are single rulers of all of the children of Israel. That's not the picture we're being given. We're being given a more complicated picture than that, and a very partial picture. So really, before we stop with this, there's lots to say about everything. Before we stop with this, and we can take a little note of the disasters at the end of the book. Let's just say that it seems that what we are being given in Judges is an overall, in this scroll, which is what it is, an overall history of a particular period of the history of the children of Israel after they have arrived in Palestine from the wilderness, before the arrival of the kings. That's the period covered, however long that period is, and we don't know exactly. The history we're given is what you could call significant history, right? As we said at the beginning last time, the major and minor judges, we have no reason to think that the major judges were more important or more successful than the minor ones, just that we are told more. Major because we know more about them, minor because we know less about them. The choice, the logical reason, given what we know, for the choice to, if you are writing Judges, right? How do you decide who's going to be a major judge and who's going to be a minor judge? Because you'll notice that some of the minor judges, are judges for a very long time. The choice seems to be based on what kind of stories you have access to about these people and how those stories fit into your overall picture that you're trying to sketch to make a particular point for the reader. Teach them what they need to know about this period of history so they will know how to think of it and also how to turn around and act in the future, right? Significant history, right? That's what the book of Judges is. This is what essentially all history up to the present day is. Modern historians like to say, oh, we don't do that anymore, we're scientific. What they do now is they've chosen different things being significant. The current fashion, which is the proper word, in the professional study of history of pretty much every age, including the ancient church, which is what I do professionally, is to get very interested in ordinary people, because they're the real people who are leading the real lives. And so then people talk, instead of talking about, St. Athanasius the Great, you talk about the nameless people who made up his congregation, stuff like that. And of course, the first thing about those people is that you don't know who they are because they're nameless. Right? But anyway, that is a choice that those people are more significant than St. Athanasius. So this is just as much significant history as the book of Judges. Everybody's selecting. You can't write down everything, right? If you kept a complete record of your life, it would take as long as your life to read it, and I'm only 58, about to be 59. But it would take 59 years to read a complete history of my life. And even I wouldn't want to read a 59-year version of the complete history of my life, and I can't imagine anyone else who would. So nobody, you can't do that. It would take longer than that to write it because writing is slower. So, history is always selective, and they always select what they think matters. What says something, which is what signify means, right? Makes a signal, makes a meaningful communication. And so, but it's important to realize that we are not being given, there's no reason for us to think that we are being given everything the author of Judges knew about this period. Rather, we are being given what the author of Judges thinks will best serve to tell us what we need to know, both in terms of what happened and also in terms of using it religiously going forward. Because this is religious history as well as political history. Significant political history, right, which we have a lot of in the United States. Profiles in Courage, right, if you've ever read that book that President Kennedy wrote when he was a young man and may have been written largely by other people. But anyway, that's significant history. He's chosen, I can't remember how many different people, 4 or 5, who were courageous at difficult times. The idea being, of course, if you read the beginning part, is what we need in America in these days, which is in the 1950s, is to be courageous. Hard to argue against that. I think we need to be courageous all the time. But that's significant history, right? All history is. Okay, so before we end with Judges, I'll just point out the fact that in chapters 17 and 18, where they fight over the idol with the people in Dan, and they hire this priest to be their priest, come and be our priest, which is not, we're not supposed to think that that's the way priests ought to be, and we're not supposed to think that that's the way the children of Israel ought to be. They make quite clear in chapter 18, verse 30, that this guy is descended from Moses. Why does that matter? That matters because, of course, Moses is the archetypal good religious leader of the children of Israel. And so if the descendants at this time of the best guy in the history of Israel are acting this inappropriately in specifically religious matters, then things are in a parlous state among the children of Israel. That's the point of that story, right? Okay, and then it ends, at the end of the book you get this destruction of some of the children of Israel so they can be gotten out of the way, so they can take their young unmarried girls to give to the survivors of the house of Benjamin, so we can have all the tribes back. As if massacring some Israelites was a way of preserving Israel. We're not supposed to think that that's a reasonable thing to do. We're supposed to think that it's a dreadful thing to do in every possible way, and it just shows how bad things are. So when we turn to Samuel, thank goodness, here comes Samuel. Good old Samuel, who is actually good. There's hope, right? When we get to Joshua says after the death of Moses, Judges begins after the death of Joshua, right? Then everything gets, goes crash into the ground. And then Samuel, the first book of Samuel begins, there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country whose name was Elkanah, and he has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Hannah, whose name means grace, right? Hannah is the Hebrew word for grace. My oldest daughter is named Annette, which is the French form. It's also a family name, but it's the French form of the Hebrew name Grace. Right? There's hope because here comes Samuel. Okay, the story, the multi-book story is knit together quite logically, as well as in narrative order. Okay, so to begin with, before we start looking at these, multiple different outlines of Samuel, I want to remind you of the fact what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel is actually a single unified work, the book of Samuel. Now we're stuck with the books of Samuel, right? This work is divided into two in the ancient period because the scrolls get to be too big. If you put it all on one scroll, it's too heavy, it pulls itself apart. So it's made into two. So we talk about 1st Samuel and 2nd Samuel, but 2nd Samuel is not a separate work from 1st Samuel. It's logically separate, they cut it at a reasonable place, but you can only understand the material in the book if you understand both of the books as a unified whole. I'll say the same thing again when we get to Kings, because it's true there too. The book of Kings is a unified whole. It is a single thing, not a double thing. Okay, Samuel is a single thing, not a double thing. So these outlines of Samuel of which I have given you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the first 2 pages. These are all outlines. Are they all? No, one of them is. They are mostly outlines of the entire book. We have one outline just of 1 Samuel, one outline of 2 Samuel, but we have 4 outlines of the 2 together, which is the only proper way to do it. So let's look here at these different outlines and try to see what they're trying to say. Okay, Satterthwaite and McConville, in that series, the name of which now escapes me because now I'm trying to remember it. Look at things this way. They see a progression of general major steps in the history of the period. So the rise of Samuel and the demise of Eli at the same time as the ark is traveling around, journeys of the ark, right? Saul becomes the king and then reigns, comes after Samuel rises, and then Samuel is the Lord's instrument in selecting Saul, right? So first you get the rise of Samuel, then you get Saul being king and reigning. Then you get David rising, and of course as David rises, Saul fades away, right? They certainly overlap. And then David becomes king in the beginning of what we call 2 Samuel, which is why it makes a reasonable divide, right? That David is the king there. And then the ark continues to journey. The ark, when David is king, the ark ends up in Jerusalem, which ends its journey. Eventually it will be put in the temple when the temple is built. Then you get David being king in 2 Samuel, and then some concluding chapters at the end to kind of round things off. Okay, so you get Eli, the old priest, whose practice and cult, the cult being the kind of organized worship, whose practice and cult is in decline. He's a good enough worshiper of the Lord, so it's a useful place for Samuel to be raised. But Samuel is the successful worshiper of the Lord, the successful prophet of the Lord, right? So Eli provides a kind of incubation for Samuel, but Eli's getting it wrong and wronger as he gets older. Samuel comes along, and then you go through the 2 kings, Saul and then David, with their struggles. And then, so that's the overall thing, say Satterthwaite and McConville. And as far as it goes, I think that's absolutely right. Okay? If you just look at 1 Samuel, Hamilton in his handbook of the historical book says, 1 Samuel, he suggests that you can make good sense of First Samuel if you think of it as sort of pairs of people as the lead characters. First, you have Samuel and Eli, prophet and priest. He says verses, right? Because you watch the one and you watch the other, and the prophet overcomes the priest and outlives him. Then you get Samuel and Saul, prophet, archbishop, religious figure. These are his words, not mine. I would never call Samuel an archbishop. I think that's misleading. But anyway, prophet versus king, right? And then and of course the prophet wins out over that king. And then you get Saul and David, king versus his successor. You get a political. So you get religious struggle, religious versus political, then political is the way the book progresses, says Hamilton. Okay, looking quickly ahead, Hamilton has a couple of other suggestions for the fourth bunch. I'm skipping over the one in the middle now. The fourth bunch on page 299, Hamilton says that we get presented with political career arcs, right? That Saul's career is sort of 23 chapters of 1 Samuel 9 through 31. David is even longer, right? 1 Samuel all the way through into 1 Kings, where he sort of finally is gone. And that both of them have rises and then tailings off, which is certainly true. It is an interesting point to me, more about this later, that the heroes of the people we have seen so far, Samuel, Eli, Saul, David. Eli has real problems and is an ultimate failure. Saul has real problems and is an ultimate failure. David has real problems. Is he an ultimate failure? That's something that people still argue about. He certainly doesn't end up in a good place. He seems to have performed his function in the sense that Solomon comes after him, which is a good thing. But none of these people are presented in unambiguously positive lights. The only guy whom, and I didn't read through everything again thinking about Samuel, but the only guy that I cannot now think off the top of my head about real problems being suggested for him by the books is Samuel. Samuel seems to be a really positive figure. And that's worth thinking about. We're going to talk about this more later. One of the things that people argue about when they argue about these books is that these books are rosy-colored, golden age of the children of Israel books, that things can't be ever have been as wonderful as they're presented, so we should not depend upon them to be historically accurate. You can certainly make that point, and you can certainly think that, but I don't think you can think that because the pictures of David and even Solomon, as we'll see in the next book, that David and Solomon are presented in a marvelous light, because they're just not. Both David and Solomon are very equivocal figures, which is one reason why I have always thought, all things being the same and knowing as much as I know, which is, I've never lived in a kingdom except for a year in Britain in school, and the Queen of England didn't go after me in any significant way. But I do know that royal governments tend to be relatively sensitive to what people say about them, especially in kind of semi-official documents like these, right? And it is very interesting that despite the fact that you'd think that all of the kings would be prettied up, since kings like to think that kings are good things, they're actually not. Kings get a pretty rough time in the Old Testament books, and that's a very interesting thing that I often think modern scholars don't consider enough. Anyway, so two more things. So all of these so far are suggestions of different ways of seeing, the big picture of what's going on in these books, and so far they're all reasonable. I think all of these things are actually going on. Satterthwaite, McConville, and the two Hamilton suggestions are pointing out real things that are really there. The last one to look at quickly is 2 Samuel in Hamilton on page 300, the bottom, chunk on this first page. He wants to say that this is what we really see is David go through stages in his career. First, he is a loyalist servant of King Saul. Then he has to run away and he becomes a kind of regional power. Then he becomes a national power. He's the guy who looks after the ark. He's the guy who's founding a house of kings that will last until the fall of Jerusalem in the 500s, a long time. He's a warrior himself. He's also a sinner, adulterer, and murderer, right? But he repents, which is a good thing. He is the founder, the head of a royal house, but his house is not calm and loving all the time. It's really in turmoil. They have internal trouble the way Gideon did with Abimelech, right? He has to run away from his own kid and then be, distraught when Absalom is killed. Everyone else is thrilled that Absalom is killed. And David even gets himself rebuked by his own officials because they say, your people are dying on the battlefield going after Absalom, and you're sad that Absalom died when he's the guy who's trying to kill you. Anyway, more about that later maybe. David struggling against adversity, and then David, in a kind of overall executioner, militarist, hymnist, and census taker. Census taking being an important thing in the Old Testament, as we have seen, and we'll see again. That makes sense as a way of saying, what's really going on in David's career. If you're thinking of David, of course, is, Saul is a failed king in very important ways, and the Lord doesn't favor him at the end of his life. But David is much more favored of the Lord, and so looking at all the different things that David does as king as they are presented in the writings, is a very reasonable way for Hamilton to go about this, because one of the things we know is that we're going to have 2 books of Samuel and 2 books of Kings, and then actually Chronicles too, right, in which we have stories about and around the kings of Israel and Judah all the way down to the final collapse of the independent kingdom in Jerusalem. David is the founding father in important ways for all of that. So what he does as the first king is very, very important. And so that's a very reasonable way to look at 2 Samuel. Interestingly, I would say that this is the kind of outline you do of 2 Samuel. If, like Hamilton, you are a professor of the Old Testament, you know the whole Old Testament, right? You know where this fits in the whole body. And so you get what David is as a figure, which is more than just a figure in the books of Samuel, right? It's a figure, he's a major figure in the whole self-understanding of Israel up to the present day. So that what David does is headline stuff in the 2nd book of Samuel. That makes perfect sense, I think. Before we turn to the detailed one on the next page, let me also say, it's very interesting. Hamilton, in his handbook, which is a very good book, the sets of books in those Baker handbooks of the Old Testament, there are 4 or 5 of them in that series. They're really interesting. They take slightly bigger scale views than commentaries do. They don't go through verse by verse. I have found them very useful to read. I would suggest them as a very useful tool to have on your shelf. Commentaries can be so detailed that they can tell you more stuff than you need, and also look at it at a more detailed level than you're really interested in, right? The handbooks tend to talk about, like, what does a book say, what's going on, and there tend to be chapter-long essays about these books. So I have found them quite useful. And in this handbook, Hamilton says, one of the things you need to know is that people who look at the books of Samuel, we talked about this in the introductory class when we were talking about the Deuteronomic history. He says that modern scholars tend to look at these books and think that the material in them is made up of material drawn from different sources, and that then they are shaped by a later hand who makes them into what these scholars call the Deuteronomic history, taking its cue from the book of Deuteronomy. So Hamilton says that, if you want to kind of know where the general consensus of people who were doing this is, he says there people imagine kind of a 5 source background for the first and second books of Samuel. You have a history of David's rise that we see coming in about 2/3 of the way through 1 Samuel, and then through the first quarter of 2 Samuel, right? Sort of, that someone would have written up an organized story of David coming to prominence. An ark narrative, that the ark itself being a religious object of tremendous religious importance and also historical importance, of course, because it comes from, the travels of the children of Israel in the wilderness. It's got the 10 Commandments in there. I mean, you don't have to see Raiders of the Lost Ark to know that in the Old Testament the Ark of the Covenant is a tremendously important thing. And so to think that someone could have written something about the Ark is certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. If I had my scripture books here, I could pull out, for example, to take another instance, if you want to look at books written about the temple, which is, after all, an object, you think, why would anyone write a book about an object? Well, I'm not particularly interested in the temple, it not being there, but there are a lot of books written about the temple, and that's an object, and you could say that the temple seems pretty clearly to be written purely to be built as a place to house the ark. So the temple is really secondary and the ark is primary, so the ark makes good sense for something to write about if you're going to write about it. A dynastic oracle, if the house of David and his family are going to be the leading group of people for the entire independent history of the life of the children of Israel, which they are, right? His descendant is finally removed from the throne and replaced by another descendant of his as the Babylonian ruler of the conquered territory, right? It makes perfect sense to think that the royal house would keep evidence around of their being chosen as the rulers. So a dynastic oracle is the kind of thing that royal houses in the ancient world keep around. That makes sense. Special stuff about Samuel, sort of making a cushion between the end of these main stories and the beginning of the stories about the kings, right? These stories being, David's psalm and David's last words and accounts of his mighty men and the census, that being sort of concluding things to kind of sum up what's been going on. That makes sense also. It makes perfect sense to think that we know, at least the book of Psalms claims, that psalms that David writes are collected together in collections, and some of those collections make it into the book of Psalms. So to think of, Psalms of David being remembered and stuck into a book about David is hardly a stretch, right? And then all of the sixth point is all of the above made use of and shaped into a coherent narrative by the Deuteronomic historian, the guy who's writing the Deuteronomic history. That is a useful thing to keep in mind, just to know that, you know, if you're trying to understand the way things look to someone who's coming at it from the point of the Deuteronomic history idea, you can look at these different sources and say, okay, the person is thinking this is a thing and it's being plugged in, and this is another thing and it's being plugged in. And if you do that, it also enables you to see what they think the Deuteronomic historian is himself producing, right? Because anything that he includes from an earlier stage, he is not himself generating. He's organizing it and using it. So, okay. Then we turn over finally to page 2. This is Harrison, whose introduction to the Old Testament I like very much. The Harrison brothers, one did New Testament, one did Old Testament. I think they're both very useful books. They're getting to be dated because they're written in the 70s, but they still do things. There's a new big introduction to the Old Testament coming out this fall in about the next month, and I have hopes that maybe it will do the same thing that Harrison's book does, but with 40 more years of scholarship included in it. As I've said before, you always want the most recent stuff in historical study because it includes the most knowledge. If that works out, then that'll be great. Until then, I'm still a fan of using the Harrison books, which are, I can never remember which is which. I think Richard is the Old Testament guy. But anyway, this is his outline of the books of Samuel. What's interesting to me about this, to begin with, is, as I said at the very bottom of the first page, this is more of a table of contents than it is of an outline, which makes it useful for us. You can find stuff this way. But what is it that Harrison is actually himself producing, right? Harrison doesn't, of course, he's counting out where the parts he thinks are important are. But if you look at the lines with the Roman numerals, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, these are the categories or stages into which Harrison is organizing the material. So he's got 7 chapters of Samuel as judge, 8 chapters of Samuel and Saul, then Saul and David, beginning in the latter part of the first book of Samuel and going through the first chapter of 2 Samuel. Then you get, Saul goes away, gets killed, and David laments. Then you get David being the king of Judah and Israel. Then you get court events. So first you get establishing David as the king, talking about that, listing his officials through whom he rules. And then you get stories about the court in section 5 for 12 chapters. And then you get these final chapters at the end, which are really kind of after the story. Burial of Saul's family, David's psalm, final words, summary of the exploits of the heroes, and then the census. So one of the things you'll notice is that this outline with tremendously more detail, and it's useful to have, and this is the kind of thing, one reason why I gave this to you, this is half a day of typing for me. One reason why I gave this to you is that this is a very useful thing to hand out if you're doing the books of Samuel with a Bible study. You can hand it to people and say, we'll do, section 2A next time, 1 chapter, and then the next time we'll do B, or, you can work your way through that way. If you look at these outlines, the numbered outline parts, it's really not very different than Satterthwaite and McConville, and it's also not all that different even from Hamilton, Samuel and Eli, Samuel and Saul, Saul and David, is just for the first book. You can see that he's doing the same kind of thing that those first 2 things on the page before are. So it's useful, I think, to look at this and be reminded of the fact that there are lots of, this is, in an important way, page 2 is a very different way of presenting the same ideas of what's going on in the book as the much, much shorter 6-line outline that we began with. I wouldn't suggest printing out the first thing on the first page and handing that around saying, here's your outline of the books of Samuel, because people don't know the material well enough to know that. They want to have something that says David and Goliath, stuff like that. So this is a more useful outline. But it's important to see that it does not represent a different understanding than the ones we had seen on the first page. Okay, I hope that that's clear. So let's turn over and begin to talk a little bit more about things on page 3. We've got 15 more minutes. We'll see how much we can do today, and then we have a whole nother week next time to look at the actual contents of the book in some detail, which will be fun. It's always fun to actually look at stuff. Harrison notes, right, that as many as 5 sources for the material have been suggested, and we get that 5-source thing from Hamilton, right, in the middle of the page. Harrison suggests the usefulness of thinking of sagas as being contained in these books. An Ark saga, Court History of David saga, Rise of David saga, maybe. And he thinks that this actually fits even better in Judges, which seems to be more completely divided into different parts that have different characters. So you'd have ones, you've got Deborah, and then you've got Samson, and then different people whose sagas are kind of disconnected from each other. That makes a lot of sense. A saga, used this way as a kind of folklore term, it doesn't necessarily mean made up, though of course you can make up a saga. Game of Thrones is a made up saga, which I'm enjoying. I read the books, so the books are quite interesting and quite different from the television show. That's a saga, which is made up. Sagas tend to focus on particular characters and sort of what they go through. So like the Odyssey is a good saga. You've got Odysseus, and he goes all over the known world and even beyond the known world. And then he ends up at home and in a kind of satisfying conclusion. That's the saga. If you read old Norse sagas, I lived in graduate school with a guy who is a professor of classics now in Germany, and he spent a year or two. His German is, he teaches in Germany now. His German was always very good, but he studied some Old Norse, and then for years when, I was trying to get my homework done, he was reading Norse sagas for fun, and he would always come charging in and read me stuff in Old Norse, and then I would say, well, that sounds great, but what happened? Then he would tell me about them. So, Old Norse sagas tend to be named for the main characters because their stories. Burnt Njal is a famous one that I actually have a copy of because he read me enough of it, so I got interested. Burnt Njal gets stuck in a farmhouse, and his enemies come and burn it down with him in it, but he survives. So he's always known as Burnt Njal because he got burned, but he survived. Anyway, that's a good saga. And that's a good kind of Judge's story, and that's actually also a good kind of David, that David hiding in the cave, and then Saul comes to use it as a latrine, and there's David, and he cuts off a little piece of his cloak, and then when Saul goes out, David, waits till he's a safe distance away and then yells to him, look, here's a piece of your cloak, I could have killed you, but I didn't. And that's a very kind of saga type story. Rise of David, that would be part of that would be a Rise of David saga. And this kind of material exists, as far as I am aware, in every cultural stream. A lot of the times it's oral rather than written, but then later they get written down when cultures develop writing. This is the way people tell stories. I have a book, Joseph Marshall III. Is a very interesting American scholar. He's a Sioux Indian, the first earner of a doctoral degree from the Sioux Nation. Actually has a little university, and he was the first person to earn a doctoral degree from them. He now teaches there. His native language is Lakota. English is his second language. He has a wonderful Indian voice. And he has written a book, A Life of Crazy Horse, which I am listening to on tape. And it's a saga of Crazy Horse, and a lot of it is, I mean, he's the first person writing it down. All the stuff he's using is oral. He's talking to old folks who knew old folks, and luckily it's not that long ago, so there's still people around. And he's probably in his 60s, Marshall is, so when he was a little boy, there were people around who knew Crazy Horse, and he asked about histories, stories of them. Crazy Horse is about to be 20, I think, in this, as far as we've gotten. The great love of his life has just married someone else, and Crazy Horse doesn't have a very happy life, but this is kind of tough. But anyway, that's a saga type story. So one of the things Harrison on page 699 is trying to say is that you can understand better the kind of history you're reading in the books of Samuel if you understand that it's not a completely different kind of thing than other cultures produce too. It is different. It is of interest to us because it is the story of the Lord's people in the world, and because the Lord is an actor in it, and because it's the background to the life of the Son of God incarnate. That's why we're reading it. But that doesn't make it not human history. This is the Word of God in the words of men, and this kind of words of men is saga type stuff, and you understand the way that works if you understand what sagas are like. And so if you read these stories about David growing up and being heroic and stuff, and understand what kind of stories they are, you will understand them better. You will better appreciate what it is you're really being shown. David, the young guy who's too young to go to battle, and he's only old enough to go take care packages to his brothers who were in the army, and he ends up fighting Goliath when he's there. Everything else aside, David says this is, so that everyone will know that there is a God in Israel. That's where I'm going to fight you, right? And that's the message. But everything else aside, it's a tremendous human story, and it has great power on a human level as well as on a theological and religious level. It in no way lessens its theological importance to recognize and focus on the human power of the stories. And one of the things Harrison is trying to say by calling these things sagas is to say you've got to pay attention to them as human stories in order to understand how they work and what's really going on. Yes, they are more, which is why we are reading them rather, in this way rather than just in a folklore class. But they also are these other things. Okay, he thinks that there are good reasons to think that some of these materials, if you're thinking of these different things like the Ark saga or the David saga, Harrison thinks that there's good reason to think that some of these things were written down either contemporaneously or very near to contemporaneous. In other words, the stuff about David, he would not be at all surprised or hostile to the idea of it being written during David's lifetime. Like the stuff about young David growing up, and being a hero and then being a regional king and having to run away and to get away from being murdered by Saul. All that stuff being written when he's later a fully established king or even a king in decline. That makes perfect sense. The authors and the compilers at this point cannot be identified. That's certainly true. But there's good reason he thinks to think that, in other words, he wants to generally agree with the idea that Hamilton's putting. Even it's interesting because in this way he's going along with some of the basic ideas of the people who want to talk about a Deuteronomic history, the idea of previously existing materials being used again. The books themselves talk about getting their material from previously existing works. And so on the surface, this seems to be a perfectly reasonable conclusion, to think that you wouldn't say, well, all the rest of the stories about this are found in the book of Jashar or something. You wouldn't say that if they weren't. First of all, people at the time that you write wouldn't know if there were a book of Jashar, so they would know if. And why would you say something like that if there weren't? If I wrote a biography of George Washington, would I say, well, these stories I'm getting from George Washington's personal reminiscences that I have in my drawer? Why would I say that when I know that anyone, at the time that I'm writing it and it gets published, they can come and look in my drawer and see there isn't anything like that there? Why would I claim that if it's not true? I've never been able to understand why people think that that's a reasonable thing for an ancient author to do, though clearly some scholars do think that. Anyway, now another point to consider, and I've talked about this before, but I'll raise it again because Harrison raises it here on page 717. The Hebrew text of the books of Samuel is famous for being in bad condition. It goes along very well, and then it breaks down. There's stuff that doesn't work grammatically. Things seem to be fractured. The Septuagint, the ancient Jewish translation into Greek, also has real problems in the book of Samuel. When you make if you're doing the ESV and you're going to make a translation of Samuel, you use the Septuagint and you use the Hebrew, and you try to combine them to get something clear, and there still are problems, and you have to make decisions, and that, I think, is important for thinking about what it is we really have, right? We have 3 more minutes, so I can say this now, and then we can pick up here later. Imagine you are the well, put it this way. I imagine that I am the Deuteronomic historian. Okay, I am making use of my 5 sources that I have, and I am combining them into a book that I am going to produce, and it will cover this part of the history of Israel. It will cover, Samuel and Saul and David, and it will fit into the total history that I am producing from the book of Deuteronomy all the way down to the fall of Jerusalem, right? And so I am going to create a history with a unified point of view. It's going to present the point of view of the history of Israel that I think people need to know about, that I think people need to have. I think this is very important for the formation of our nation going forward as a religious and political entity. Would I do this and produce a text which is a complete mess? The book of Deuteronomy, as I began in the first day saying, is famous for having the best text of any Old Testament book. Would I, creating other books to fit in together with Deuteronomy, leave them in complete disrepair? No, I would not. Suppose my teacher were, the Deuteronomist, and he died. Would I leave his work in complete disrepair and just copy it and say, this is what we have, it's a complete mess, it doesn't work grammatically, we can't read it all, but we'll just do the best we can? No, I would fix it. Right? I think one of the strongest arguments against thinking of the Deuteronomic historian as a person producing a unified thing is that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are in very bad textual condition, and I don't think that makes any sense with that picture. I think the only thing that makes sense is to think of these things as being compiled over time, maybe brought together from different sources and stuff, but compiled and then preserved, not having someone sit down and you know, being the final author, that kind of thing. Because a final author, you know, if you're bothering to do this much work because you're trying to have people read something that means a particular thing, you will make certain that it says what it needs to say in order to accomplish that. You will not leave something behind which is incoherent and incomprehensible. And that's what 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings periodically are. And so I think the strongest argument against the existence of a Deuteronomist is the fact that the texts that are left behind are not the kind of texts that that sort of person would produce and settle for. Okay, that got us through kind of overviews of Samuel. We'll come back and look at some of the actual content of the books next time. I'm sorry that this always seems to be warming up and never seems to be getting there. But as a matter of fact, this is one of the reasons why it makes sense to study the historical books. They are chock-block full of content, but they need to be approached with an understanding of what they are in mind, or you can't make any sense of them. So anyway, the project continues. Thank you for your patience.